Number 1. I'm a 25-year-old female. This particular incident I'm about to describe happened a couple of years ago at a bar my friend and I frequented weekly. Looking back on it, I realize now how much danger we were in and how fortunate we were to come out unscathed. Also, I apologize in advance for how long this is. I tend to be very detailed in my storytelling. So before I get ahead of myself, allow me to rewind to a couple of hours before this incident began. It was a few hours before my friend had to go into work, and we had plans to grab a few drinks before she hit up her shift at a local bar. I had just arrived at her house, and we were on our regular walk to the bar, not the same one that she works at, which is not by any means a long distance, but does involve weaving through some shady areas and a dark trail that we sometimes take when it's still light outside and there's enough of us that we can handle ourselves. This night, though, it was just me and my friend, and it was very dark, so we took the longer way. I remember thinking how menacing the moon looked as it glowered an eerie orange in the night sky. A premonition maybe, eh? Probably not. I'm just a very observant girl. We made it to the bar safe and sound, and were in the middle of ordering our drinks when a group of 9 men, all decked out in business suits, entered the room. Upon second glance, we noticed they had a woman with them. She was young, appearing to be in her early 20s. And unlike the men whom were dressed like they were about to sit down for a business conference, she was dressed in casual jeans and a t-shirt. This was the first detail I noticed that seemed odd to me, but I shrugged it off. I didn't know them, and it wasn't my business. As far as I was concerned, they were just a group of businessmen who'd just come back from a long and probably very boring conference and now were just unwinding for the rest of the night. The woman was probably a friend of theirs that met up with them along the way. No big deal at all. Still, they stood out like a sore thumb, and so every so often we would look over at them to find they were already staring in our direction. Alright, fine. They probably just sense we've been paying closer attention to them than normal. We paid them no more attention and chattered amongst ourselves about the things we usually do. Work, our social lives, our love lives, nothing that anyone would find to be of great interest. I tuned out of our conversation, though, when I felt the men's eyes on us again. My ears perked at the mention of a few notable key words. 2 girls. Very pretty. Want the blonde. My stomach clenched. If they were talking about us, I was definitely the blonde girl. My friend's hair is as dark as night, and me just the opposite. With the way that they were looking over at our table, I knew they meant to us. Needless to say, I was instantly uneasy at the idea of 9 random men talking amongst themselves in hushed voices about me and my friend. Then, to my dismay, the woman of the group came over to our table. This caught my friend's attention too, and her eyes scanned the woman with an expression that mirrored my own. The woman smiled brightly at us instantly, giving off a friendly vibe. Too friendly. I hope this doesn't come off as creepy, but I just wanted to tell you that you girls are absolutely beautiful, she said. Thanks, I said, instantly wary. My friend nodded a thanks too, barely looking at her, but she too looked uneasy. The woman seemed to take this to mean an invitation to sit with us, because that's exactly what she did. Before I realized what was happening, she had scooted into the booth to sit right next to me. "See those guys over there?" she said, pointing at the table of men from which she had come from. Yeah. "Well, they've been wanting to talk to you girls from the moment they saw you both. But, they're really shy, so they asked me to come over here and talk to you for them." That's nice," I said, completely baffled by how weird all this shit was. "If they want to talk, though, they could have just come over here themselves." "I told you, they're shy," she said, and then giggled like a schoolgirl. That made her seem way younger than she was. Yeah, I thought. All 9 of these fully grown men are surely too shy to talk to a couple of 20-year-old girls. "See that cute dark-haired one with the beard on the far left?" she asked, pointing out to one of the men at the table that fit that description. "He's been dying to ask you out," she said to me, and then pointing to another guy she proceeded to gush to my friend about how he was interested in her as well. When we didn't look as enthused as she expected, she prattled on about how she had known these men all of her life and how sweet and trustworthy they were, and that we just had to take her word for it because she's a girl too and she has our backs. Something like that. Yes, how very convenient that the supposedly sweetest guys of the group had an eye on each of us respectively. I fought the urge to roll my eyes at how obvious of a setup this was. I waited impatiently for her to just cut to the bullshit and get to the proposition she had clearly come over here for. "I know how this must look to you girls, and you're probably used to this all the time. I totally get it. I would think the same thing. Us girls, we have to look out for ourselves, right?" Yes, she actually had the nerve to say this. "You seem like smart girls. It's good to have a head on your shoulders, but you have nothing to worry about. I've known these guys since we were children, and they wouldn't harm a hair on anyone's head, much less 2 pretty girls like yourselves." More flattery, more grooming. I had to hand it to her. This girl was a crafty manipulator. She was telling us everything a girl in our position would want to hear, playing the female ally card to gain our trust. It was becoming blatantly obvious what role this woman played in this men's agenda. A female pursuer would seem much less threatening to 2 young females. I was disgusted. Anyways, the guys and I are about to leave for name of local club, and we'd love if you girls came along. You can come your own way and meet us there if you are more comfortable. They'd totally understand. They're totally gentlemen. I fucking bet. And don't worry, they'll pay for everything. Final red flag unleashed. This was far shadier than the motives of your average pickup artists. My friend and I shared a look of bewilderment from across the table, and then nodded in understanding as we came to an unspoken agreement as to how to deal with this situation. "Well, we appreciate it and tell them we are really flattered," my friend said politely with the fakest smile I've ever seen her muster plastered on her face. "But we're just leaving." The girl frowned, not even bothering to hide her disappointment. "Why? Where are you girls off to?" My friend shot her a look of annoyance, clearly put off by this woman's nosiness, but she said, "I have to work in 30 minutes. This actually wasn't entirely a lie. My friend was due to come into work, but not for a few hours. And this is when the girl's demeanor changed. Gone was the personable and sweet girl trying to be our friend to reveal a fucking snake. I'm not even exaggerating. In seconds, this woman transformed before our very eyes into a stone-cold predator. She was still speaking in the same friendly and polite tone, but her smile had twisted into a sneer, and her eyes had narrowed into beady slits as she glowered at my friend. "How much?" "What?" my friend asked, completely baffled. "How much would you be making tonight?" she asked, although it sounded more like a demand than an inquiry. My friend divulged the amount. The girl nodded and then walked off. We thought that was the end of it, and we breathed a sigh of relief. We could see she looked like she was conferring with her comrades about something, and then before we could move a muscle, she was walking back towards our table, looking more menacing than ever now. She took her seat next to me again. "What if I told you we would pay you twice the amount of money you'd be making tonight if you come party with us?" she asked. "I'd say, that's cool, but like you guys would do that anyway," my friend said with a strained smile. The girl grinned, taking out her purse and pulling out the fucking fattest wad of cash, dumping it on the table in front of us. Our jaws dropped. "This is 3 times the amount you'd be paid tonight," she said. She even counted it for us. Now we knew something was terribly, terribly wrong, and that our male friends weren't just pickup artists or even rapists. This was a business conference after all, just a very different kind. "Okay," my friend blurted out. I shot her a look that read something like, "What the fuck are you doing?" But she insisted that we go with them and that it would be fun. Here I was worried that I would have to do some serious damage control when she said, "We'll go, I just have to go to the bathroom and freshen up." "Oh." The woman seemed pleased with this, and smiling, she put the money back in her purse and walked back to the table. One of the men looking over at us smiled and waved. We jumped up from our seats and practically raced to the direction of the bathrooms, which is in a hallway right around a corner that would conceal us from their praying eyes. As soon as we got the chance to talk, we shared the same thought, that these people were running a sex trafficking ring and we needed to get out of here now. Our plan was to take the back exit, which was further down the hall from the bathrooms, but after some deliberation, we considered that the woman might be onto what we were really planning and would be waiting for us on the other side of the door. The back door also led into an alley, and we agreed that especially in a situation like this, it was far too risky. As luck would have it too, her phone was temporarily out of service and mine was dead. We decided that we would have to enlist a staff member's help. We walked back to the table and told them that we'd be going with them just as soon as we order our drinks. One of them offered to get it for us, but we were already power walking over to the bartender. We told him everything. They must have noticed we were talking to him for longer than was necessary to order a few drinks, and thank God they booked it out of there. All the same, the bartender told us not to go out there as they might be waiting for us outside, and that he'd call a cab for us to make sure we got home safely. Thankfully, when our cab arrived and we stepped outside, half expecting them to jump out of the shadows and conk us over the head with bats, there was nobody in sight. We hurriedly climbed into the cab and took it back to her place. I'm fully convinced that if we had agreed to go with them, we would have been drugged and sold into the sex trade. I'd probably be holed up in some prison somewhere across the world right now. The suits, the business-like nature of the meeting, the woman they sent over to try to gain our trust, the bribery. This was some seriously shady shit. The final nail in the coffin, though. A week later, a girl from the area was declared missing, and her body was found dumped in a creek outside of the city a month after this incident. Apparently, the last she was spotted was in that fucking area of town. I don't know if there's any connection to these two events. They very well could have nothing to do with each other, but I can't help thinking there was. Number 2. So, I have to keep this very general, but I have to share. I'm a therapist, and while I was in grad school, I began an internship that provided group and individual counseling to a halfway house. This halfway house was run by a church and their well-meaning congregation, but was a bit of a mess. After several months of working with them, I got a phone call from the house parent that said none of the residents were willing to attend group sessions if their new housemate would be involved. The house parent made some comments about typical house drama, so I wasn't too worried about it and just told them to go ahead and bring the residents to the clinic, and I would work with the new housemate privately to figure out what was going on. I met with the new housemate first, and they seemed a bit reserved and untrusting, but nice. When I asked about issues in the house, they gave a small curved smile and raspy chuckle. I pushed them a bit further, but all they would say was that the others were scared. We ended our session agreeing to meet weekly. I had the group session next, new housemate not included, to get a feel with what was going on from the others. When I walked in, I could tell there was something seriously wrong. Their faces looked terrified. Their general appearances were disheveled, and they were all looking anxiously around at each other. I asked what was going on, and no one answered. They asked me what I thought of the new housemate, and I redirected back to them. The anxious eye contact continued. I asked again and reminded them that change and growth couldn't occur without honesty. Finally, one of them started talking. Here's the story from their perspective. We were told that we were getting a new housemate that we weren't supposed to have much interaction with, and that they wouldn't be there long. No one would give us any info about why the new housemate would be getting the only private bedroom or why they wouldn't be participating in classes or group activities. They just told us to leave them be. This went on for a couple weeks. Then they started letting the new housemate hang out and participate in things. They would make some strange comments that would make us uncomfortable, but we would just ignore them. They wouldn't sleep. They would always leave their bedroom after they thought everyone was asleep, go into our rooms, check to see if we were actually asleep by holding their finger under our nose. Then, they would leave and walk through the backwoods. They would always be back in the morning, and we would tell the house parent, but would be told to be quiet and not talk about this with anyone. One night after dinner, we turned on the ID channel and new housemate was watching with us. A few minutes into the episode, they got up and walked into the woods. Usually did this super late at night. A few minutes later, we heard it. Their name in the episode. We couldn't be sure, so we went to the computer and checked and saw that they had tortured and murdered several women. There's more details to the story that I can't share here, but needless to say, my new client was a convicted serial killer that raped, tortured, and murdered at least 3 women in our area. This individual was being let out on a technicality that affected several of the murders they were charged with, so got released early on the condition that they lived under supervision. This particular halfway house was being paid to hold this person until a more appropriate structure was in place. After I had done my own research and confirmed, I went to my supervisor and professor, and the contract with that particular church and halfway house was terminated. Icing on the cake, The next year of my life was absolute hell as I was stalked, my home invaded, my dogs injured, my house and car vandalized, and survival items that didn't belong to me were found in my attic that made it look like someone had been living there. I would come home, and the house would look different than the way I left it. The police came to my house over a dozen times through that year and did nothing. So my family hired a security team and installed cameras. 6 months later, a perpetrator was arrested on my property, and eyewitnesses and evidence linked him to the crimes. Perpetrator had been out of prison for just over a year on rape and kidnapping charges. Guess who was from the same small hometown as the man arrested? My client. This incident was over 10 years ago, and the stalker is still in jail to this day. Number 3.
This story happened 3 years ago, around the time that COVID started, so it was a while back, but still worthy of a post. It was early 2020, and I had just gotten a new job in a small town near my area. While looking for a place to live, my sister offered to rent her house to me. She had bought the house 2 years prior, but she and her husband didn't really take to it, and their commute to work was long, so they moved out and the house was uninhabited. Luckily for me, it was actually pretty close to my workplace, around a 40-minute drive, and my sister pretty much rented it for free to me. I just paid for the water and electricity and looked after the house. I was living there for a solid 2 or 3 months and had already gotten used to it. One night, after coming back from work and parking my car, as I walked towards my door, I noticed something odd. There was a cigarette butt on the curb to my house. I leaned down and picked it up, thinking that it might have been mine since I'm a smoker, but after looking at the brand name, I realized that it wasn't mine and threw it away. I didn't think much of it and just shrugged it off as some person throwing it at my curb. I went on with my night, and nothing unusual happened. 2 days later, I was once again walking to my house when I spotted a few more cigarette butts, this time near my porch. Needless to say, I was pretty mad about it and thought that someone sat at my porch and smoked, but since I didn't know who it was, there was nothing I couldn't do about it. I noticed that they were put out pretty recently, so whoever it was probably walked off as I was approaching. That night, I was watching a movie on my laptop, and it was pretty late, past 1 a.m., so I was surprised when I heard a car passing by. It's a suburban neighborhood, and it was COVID, so people rarely ventured out at night, but I didn't think much of it. Around half an hour later, I was surprised when I heard chattering nearby. I listened intently, but I couldn't hear what they were talking about as their voice seemed almost muffled and quiet. By this point, I was getting a bit unnerved, so I stopped the movie and quietly got off my sofa and walked to the front door to make sure that it was locked. As I was approaching the door, I froze mid-step as I heard the two approaching my porch and reducing their talking to a whisper. I realized right away that whoever this was wanted to break in. I leaned against my front door and waited, expecting a loud bang against the door or the doorknob being shaken, but it was oddly quiet. I decided to walk over to my window to see if they had walked away or changed their mind. My windows have bars from the inside out that you have to unlock so that you could move the curtains or look out the window comfortably. I slowly unlocked the bar mechanism and lifted it up. I moved the curtains and was taken aback. Leaning up against my window was a man. He was as startled as I was because he basically stuttered over his own steps as he jumped back. He tightened his hoodie to cover his face, so all I could really see was his big blue eyes looking at me. His friend realized what was going on and right away started to kick the door in. He kicked it a solid 4 or 5 times, but the door wouldn't budge. All the while I was staring at them frozen in fear and trying to comprehend the situation. I snapped out of it and slammed the bars over my window, locking them and running upstairs to the storage room where I pushed a table up to the door and called the cops. As I listened and expected the two to come inside any minute, I heard a loud crash and the bars from the windows being shaken aggressively. When they realized that they couldn't get in, one of them let out a long, angry scream that probably woke up half the neighborhood. By the time the cops came, they were long gone. The police couldn't find out who it was, but were more active in the neighborhood in the following weeks. Regardless, I wasn't too keen on staying there, so shortly after, I moved out. My sister sold the house a few months later, and as far as I know, nothing similar ever happened since. I honestly don't know what they wanted or why they were so determined to get in, but whoever it was, let's not meet again.
Number 4.
This story probably occurred close to 20 years ago. I'll recount it as best I possibly can. My brother and I were camping at a little spot called Lulworth Creek, just outside of our hometown of Charters Towers, which sits a couple of hours west of Townsville in North Queensland. The spot we were at was a well-kept secret at the time, a tiny little patch of paradise where the water from the creek flowed over some rocks, and then opened up into a beautiful waterhole, a great spot for camping. Just up the road a ways was Echo Hole, which Australian readers may know of. So, the day went by mostly uneventful. We swam, we cooked, we drank, we ate. You know, the usual. As it was winter at the time, the sun started disappearing around 7, so we lit up the campfire and started to settle in for the night. About an hour later was when the weird things started happening. It started with the fire. Now we were pretty experienced campers. We knew how to build a fire, obviously, and we knew how to build one to last the night, which is why we were surprised, dumbfounded, and more than a little scared when we walked away to grab some things out of the car and returned to find the fire had completely gone out. It was not a rainy day. The fire was nowhere near the water's edge. It was not humid in any way. The air was hot and dry, and the firewood we were using was dry as a bone. There is no logical reason that this campfire should have extinguished, so that was weird occurrence number 1. More than a little weird, but easy enough to brush off. Occurrence number 2 came about a little while later. We were sitting around the fire that we had since got going again, just sitting enjoying the peace and quiet. Now this is noteworthy, as it was deafeningly quiet. As I said, this spot was a well-kept secret. No one, and I mean no one, was anywhere within about 20 kilometers of us, and we would have heard them approaching from far away if they were. Suddenly, breaking the silence, we heard in the darkness the unmistakable sound of someone. Yes, someone jumping into the waterhole. This one freaked us the heck out. Not just weird, not just a little spooky, no, this was one of those moments where you feel absolutely gripped and immobilized by stone-cold fear rushing through your entire body. Because what came next would make the initial sound seem like child's play. About 10 meters from us or less, the dank, wet sound of footsteps running through the scrub, now on our side of the waterhole. I have played this through in my mind many times throughout the years. I have attempted to come up with any possible explanation as to what could have happened, but I swear to God there was no one there, and yet there was someone there. After this occurrence, we immediately began packing up the car. Important note here, as we were packing up, we had all of the car doors open to make it easier to load everything up. That becomes relevant in a moment. As we're walking back to the tent to start packing it up, out of nowhere the entire thing just shifts sideways, as if a huge gust of wind blew into it, or more disturbingly, something or someone ran into it. There was no wind that night. I mean, the air was completely still. Just like the campfire from earlier, there is no logical reason this should have happened. At this point, we thought to heck with the tent, we'll get a new one, we're out of here. And this was the point at which the final occurrence of the evening took place, and sent us barreling out of there as fast as our little Ford Laser would take us. Okay, let me try to explain this the best I can. The car was parked sideways on an angle, right? The doors that were still open were on the side that was slanted down, and opened all the way, so gravity was keeping them open. In an instant, with no wind, no breeze, no anything around, those doors slammed shut. That was it. Perhaps I can look back on this night now and question it with a logical mind. But in that moment, there was no question in our minds that we were being antagonized by some otherworldly force, the intentions of which we had no clue and certainly were not sticking around to find out. We jumped in the car and we booked it. To this day, I have never gone back to that waterhole. Ever. And I probably never will. Like I said, there's 1,000,001 logical explanations I could come up with looking back on it. But in my heart, I just know that every one of those is wrong. Interesting note. Just this year, we've had Survivor Australia in town filming their current season out around these parts. That's actually what got me thinking about this incident. Unsure if they did any filming at this particular waterhole, but I will watch with interest to find out.
Number 5.
This story happened to me back when I still lived at my parents' house. I was commuting to college at the time and had 3 siblings that also lived at home, my brother and 2 sisters. For some context, we lived on 5 acres in rural Ohio, surrounded on both sides by woods and farm fields. Additionally, during the week, my dad normally left for work at 2 a.m., so I had always felt like it my job to be the man of the house, because he was gone during the times when you would imagine something sketchy happening. However, on this night, because it was the weekend, my dad was home. I woke up to the sound of my brother's voice trying to get my attention. We had separate rooms upstairs, and coming out of our rooms, you could look down over the banister and to see our front door. When I woke up, it took a few moments to get out of the haze and realize what was going on. I looked at the clock and it was around 2:30 a.m., and my brother told me there were 2 men at our front door. Now this really woke me up. We quietly walk out of my room and peek over to look down at the front door. When we looked, there was no one at the door, but I noticed my parents off to the side, out of view of the glass on the front door. I whispered down to my dad, and he told me there were 2 guys who had been talking to each other and knocking on the door. Hearing my dad say this freaked me out even more. I went back into my room and grabbed my pistol, quickly shuffling down the stairs after looking to make sure they weren't at the door. If they had been, they would have easily seen me coming down the stairs, as it is in direct view of the door. My brother is right behind me as we head over to where my parents are, whispering to try and find out what is going on. My parents had awoken to the sound of our dog barking and had come out to find these 2 men knocking loudly at the door. At this point, the men returned and began knocking again, despite the fact that no one had come to the door and our dog was still actively barking. The fact that they were there at this time, in a location where houses are spread out hundreds of yards, and still knocking with the dog barking, made the situation even more terrifying. After a couple of minutes, the men walked away, and we all shuffle across the kitchen into the family room to peek out the windows into our driveway, which is lit up by our outside light. There was a black Cadillac sitting there, but no one was inside from what we could see. Immediately, the question was, where did these guys go? They weren't in their car, and they were no longer at the front door. Unfortunately, we figured out the answer when the handles on our back French doors started jiggling. They were actively trying to enter the back of our house, which enters into the kitchen. At this point, I just remember my mom frantically saying, "David," to my dad, as pure terror overwhelmed her. Then 2 things happened. Adrenaline filled my body as I prepared my handgun, horrified at the very real possibility that I might have to shoot these men. Secondly, my dad finally grabbed the phone, called the police, and calmly told them what was happening. Thankfully, after a minute of jiggling, they stopped at the back door and disappeared again, only to return to their knocking at the front. However, at this point, several minutes had gone by, and suddenly we saw the local police fly up in multiple cruisers with their lights on. As they whipped into our driveway and front yard, the two men bolted away, attempting to run the long way around the house across the driveway. One of them disappeared out of our view, but the other one was intercepted by an officer yelling for him to get on the ground. He didn't, and he was immediately tased and fell on the ground. Some of the officers went around the house after the other guy, and one of them came to talk to my dad and I as we came out the front. They ended up finding the other man hiding in my sister's little playhouse in the backyard. It appears both of them were drunk or high, as the one who hid had cocaine on him. While they were both arrested that night, we never did find out what they were charged with or what happened to them. Needless to say, the whole experience wasn't fun. So, random men at our door in the middle of the night. Let's not meet again.
Number 6. I live in the outskirts of one of the largest cities in the Northeast, in a quiet section of the city with a small town feel. I go to a gym in the suburbs and was headed home after a pretty intense workout, ready to get home, pet my dog, and take a much-needed shower. Now, to get back into my section of the city from the suburbs, there is an old 4-lane bridge that leads into a few of the main streets of the neighborhood. The lanes aren't separated by markings, but there are signs on the bridge, and everyone respects the 2 cars to a lane policy. As I was driving across the bridge, I stayed in the right lane to go straight across, as the left lane is a turn lane. As I reached the end of the lane, I noticed that the car at the end was over into my lane by about a foot, and I did my best to cut around him, one of my tires ending a bit up on the sidewalk as I made my way into my lane. I glanced over at this guy, didn't flip him off or act aggressively, but I'm sure my face expressed my thought of, "What the fuck are you doing, dude?" The light turned green and I went straight across, and noticed that the car had been blocking my lane, despite being in the turning lane, went straight as well. Looking at my rearview mirror, I could see an illuminated Uber light in his windshield. I continued up this semi-residential street, stopping at each stop sign on the way up, this car remaining behind me the whole way. As I was already thinking, this guy doesn't know how to drive. I kept an eye on my rear view as I approached another main street in the area. As I was waiting at the light, I noticed that this guy had turned his Uber light off, and something in me realized that something was wrong. I'm not sure what it was, but that Uber light gave me some sort of comfort that this guy was working, and his conscious act of turning it off made me uneasy. As I turned onto the main street, I made the first left turn that I could, and the Uber made the turn behind me. I was now on a residential street, but as I knew the area, I drove at a conscious pace, making a couple turns heading towards the highway. The Uber pursued, his bumper about 1.5 feet from mine. Halfway down the residential street, there was no doubt in my mind that I was being pursued. Now, despite having a very buttoned-up office job and a soft-spoken personality, I don't necessarily think I'm a prime target for being chased. I'm a big guy. I'm between 6'5", 6'6", a little under 220 pounds, muscular, and have a ton of tattoos. I'm sure this guy saw me as I pulled up next to him on the bridge, and from my glance at him, he looked older and much smaller than myself. While the thought of pulling over and escalating things did cross my mind with the rate of gun crime in my city, that thought was gone as soon as it came. All I could focus on was getting to a safe place and making sure this maniac didn't find out where I lived. As I turned onto the highway, he followed again, cutting across several lanes and accelerating to catch up to me. I made the first right I was able to, then led him down a winding maze of back streets, his car inches from my bumper the entire time. I wasn't paying attention to one-ways, stop signs, or speed limits at this point. I just knew that I needed to get away. All the while, the Uber followed, matching my speed and taking every sharp turn I did through the maze of streets. Realizing that I needed to get back to a more populated area in case this guy decided to shoot me or hit my car, I headed back in the direction of the main street, spotting out of the corner of my eye the parking lot of a fast food restaurant that provided a shortcut to the main road. I blasted through the parking lot, this man speeding in after me, and I felt hopeless. If this guy was willing to follow me through all of that, he couldn't stop until he caught me. I weighed my options as I turned onto the main street. Police department was about a 10-minute drive away, but there were several lights and crosswalks between myself and safety. I decided that I would head through the back streets in the direction, trying my best to lose him as I went. I didn't want to give this guy an opportunity to get out of his car in a red light and hurt me in some way. I had to head in that direction and pray that I didn't hit any red lights. As I rounded the corner out of the parking lot, my worst-case scenario was revealed. A red light with a car already stopped, opposing traffic. I don't one-way to my left with a car ready to make a turn. I know it was irresponsible, but I didn't hesitate. I merged into the oncoming lane and made a left going the wrong way down a one-way residential street. A few beeps from other cars around me rang out, but I didn't care. I just prayed that I had made an irresponsible enough maneuver to throw this guy off and created enough confusion to get away. I looked in my rear view and did not see headlights. I drove to the end of the block of the one-way. I made a few random turns down side streets, pulling into the parking lot of an apartment complex and turning my car off. My adrenaline was winding down, and I could not stop shaking. I laid my seat all the way back and called the police non-emergency line. The lady who answered the phone was entirely unhelpful and directed me to call 911. All I had was a brief description of the car and guy, whose face I could not recall well. The police told me they were just going to write it up as a disturbance. They told me to drive home as some time had passed between the chase ending and their getting to me. Being the ever-paranoid person that I am, I parked several blocks down from my house, changed clothes in my car, put on a hat, and walked home, on the lookout for this guy and his car the whole way. I thought I saw his car turn left down another block as I walked, but I told myself that even if it was him, he wouldn't be able to recognize me outside of my car. Now, as I'm home typing this out, my large dog next to me and a drink in my hand, I feel helpless. I'm scared to drive my car in the city and run into this crazy person, scared of what he might do to me. I'm worried this guy will drive around and see my car, find out where I live, and try to come after me or my family in some way. I've never felt this vulnerable before in my entire life. I've never considered purchasing a weapon legally, but this encounter is making me consider it. All I can do now is try to move on and hope that he doesn't get any rides in the area. So, deranged Uber driver who chased me through the back streets of my city because he didn't understand traffic patterns, I hope I never see you again.